Welcome to the Path to Wholeness, where we explore the deep questions, struggles, and longings that shape our lives. I'm Bethany Ward, a spiritual director and guide in the sacred and imaginal. Through conversations, reflections, and practices, this podcast invites you to reconnect with the sacred currents in your life and uncover the beauty of living with intention and wonder. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome my friend Carrie Elvey, a naturalist and blacksmith from Darwin's dream. Together, we're exploring the intersection of science and spirit, how scientific observations of nature evoke awe and wonder, and how to reconcile the rigor of skepticism with the mystery of intuition. This is a conversation about curiosity, connection, and the shared wisdom found in different ways of seeing the world. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I am so excited to be sitting down with you. We have had so many rich conversations about just this, and it is exhilarating to be able to share them with a wider audience. So please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit how you became a blacksmith and a naturalist.
So I've pretty much been a naturalist my whole life. I was always the kid who was coming home with salamanders in her pockets and rocks that ended up in the washing machine. And I worked at a nature center for about 24 years. Absolutely loved that work and decided it was time to try something new. So I'm now part-time naturalisting. I work at a bug zoo with all wonderful things buggy. And I'm using blacksmithing as a way to take my love of nature to just a different level and use that kind of natural inspiration, not only for art, but also to use in that artwork to inspire others and teach others.
It does indeed inspire others. And if I were to condense you into one word, it would be inspirer. And you and I met at the Wilderness Center many moons ago. And in those conversations that we would have as we were getting to know each other, we began to recognize that my perspective of the world as a spiritual director was very similar to your perspective on the world as a naturalist. So let's bring everyone into those conversations on how they began and what rooted them. So as I said moments ago, you are definitely an inspirer. And what is it about natural history that speaks to you specifically? Because I'm sure that is very similar to how spiritual formation speaks to me.
Well, I think the first conversation that really sticks that we had, where I thought, oh, this is weird. There's just something really unique. Was we were standing in the hallway, a bunch of us having a conversation about mushrooms, and we were talking about the way that mushrooms are connecting different trees and feeding information, and how they're just the great connectors. And that's always been something that's really that idea has really fascinated me, that there's so much going on that we can't really see, but there's all these really fascinating natural history stories. And as we were talking about that, I realized that was kind of exactly the same thing you were doing as you were helping families and talking about spiritual direction, this idea that it's all about connection and forming these stories and feeding each other through unseen means. And I think those are the things that have always really inspired me. There's just so much happening there that we don't see on a surface level in nature, and clearly that's true in the spiritual realm as well.
And at that time, I was serving as a burial steward within conservation burial, and the way that we were offering comfort to our families was through the recognition and naming of the interconnection of both nature and our experience as humans. So when departed loved ones were placed within this beautiful conservation cemetery, they had a sense of connection and a sense of continuity. And so we began to recognize together that we were really having a shared language. We were saying the same things from different perspectives. And that deepened for us into this awareness that awe and wonder was really this connecting point, both for you as a naturalist and for me as a spiritual director. So how would you define awe and wonder from your perspective as a naturalist?
I think it's just so inherent in the way our brains are made, or in the way we live our lives, that we walk outside and we see a blue sky and it's beautiful, or we see a bird and it's beautiful. You can't really separate the two. You can't separate being a good naturalist or teaching nature to people without that sense of awe. It's about us sometimes having to help people find that sense of awe and wonder when, every kid likes rocks and bugs, and we lose that sometimes as we grow up. So I always thought of my job as really helping people remember that joy. And for me, it was always easy because that's what nature is, and I can't ever really separate those two. But I think it's that looking at something and seeing that there's something more than just what we see. That's that awe and that wonder.
That's something more. And that is very much how I would describe both my work as a religious professional, but also my work as a spiritual director, that our task as spiritual leaders is to help people remember who they are. So you were talking about us being children and engaged with the natural world, and then we lose that. But it's similar to our spiritual expression. We all have big wonderings as children, and we need to reconnect with those big wonderings, because to do an adult life without the understanding that there's more to you, it becomes, we have a crisis of meaning. It becomes isolating. It becomes lonely. And awe from the perspective of spiritual formation is really an entry point. It moves us back into our spiritual expression, that there's so much more than a humanist perspective, that there's a transcendent component to being human. And my task is to discover what that means for me.
I think that's true. Even just, we learned, especially during the pandemic, how important access to nature was, and how important being able to be out in nature was for people's mental health, for their physical health. But so many people reconnected with that aspect of their lives during COVID because they were sort of forced to. We had to be apart from each other. And I think as soon as people started getting out into nature, they started asking themselves some of those same questions. What is that tree? Oh my gosh, this is such a beautiful whatever. Why is it that way? How did it get that way? And so it naturally, just the access to it naturally opened up people's curiosity about the who, what, why, where, when, and how. And I'm assuming that is also true in the work that you do, is once we're exposed to it, then we start to think about the questions to ask, but we have to have that initial exposure to even really think about what kinds of things we should be thinking about or things we should be seeking out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very much when people enter into the container of spiritual direction. Oftentimes they are in the dark night of the soul, and they sense something deep within them that is calling to something larger, or they've had some kind of profound phenomenon. It can be everything from, I felt a sense of presence in a prayerful moment to having a direct divine experience. So something invites us into that space, whether it's a tree or a transcendent experience. So when you're observing nature scientifically, do you ever feel a sense of connection or presence?
Yeah, I think always. I don't think you can separate the two. I think that's one of the reasons that so many of the famous naturalists were also artists. Think about Darwin or Ernst Haeckel. Those naturalists, or Maria Sibylla Merian, those folks were, those two sides of their brains work together. And I think you can't look at nature from any kind of standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, from an artistic standpoint, without asking those kinds of questions. And I think science especially, that's what science is. Science is awe. It's being amazed at the way the world works and wanting to find out how it works that way. And you can't be a scientist without that sense of awe and wonder and wanting to know more.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that is such the foundation of a true spiritual expression, too. The death of faith is certainty. So when we are certain about something, we are unable to live within the mystery. We are able to have a sense of faith. And if we can move ourselves into awe and wonder, that keeps us ever seeking what the divine has for us, and ever seeking what the divine means to us. So in both disciplines, we have to begin and we have to further with awe and with wonder.
I think that's true for the hardcore sciences. You make a hypothesis, you answer a question, you do this experiment, you come up with an answer. But scientists are the most skeptical people. They're constantly assuming that what they've learned, that there's more to know, or questioning your work. I mean, that is part of being a scientist, is knowing that we don't have all the answers, and nor will we ever have all the answers. I think that gets missed sometimes when people think about scientists. Scientists are the last people who will say they know or have all the answers. And naturalists, as a subset of that, we have even less answers.
Mm-hmm. And that is the same necessary component for a spiritual seeker. What don't I know, and may I always remain in the unknowing? And I think we are similarly missing something in spiritual discourse, that this isn't about something dogmatic. It is something contemplative and reflective and ever unfolding. And it is that allows us to live a deep spiritual life.
Yeah, and that idea of always living in the unknowing, I think that's one of the things I've always loved about being a naturalist the best, is that I know I will never know everything there is to know about a tree. E.O. Wilson, who was a great naturalist and entomologist, he's famous for his work with ants, but he did a lot of work in the rainforest, and he's always said that you could spend your entire career studying one tree and one section of one rainforest and never have all the answers to all the life that was happening on that one tree. And I think instead of finding that daunting, I find that immensely comforting, that we're not expected to have all the answers, because we can't ever have all the answers.
Mm-hmm. And yet we do get glimpses. And I think that is why I'm always called towards the mystical, or towards divination and direct divine participation, because we have these little glimpses of the tree. We have these little glimpses of divine expression, and that moves us, further into wanting to know more and wanting to engage further. But we have to hold that paradox of that there's so much we will never know, and yet we can delight and relish in those small elements that we do, and those small glimpses that we do.
And sometimes as a naturalist, if I'm leading a nature hike, I don't like to be a point and namer. Like, walk around and say, this is a mayapple, this is a trillium. That is not a nature hike. That is just a checklist. And so to be a really good naturalist, your job is to hold some of that, to not tell people all of the story all at once, and to let them expose the wonder. One of the best interpretive principles there is to, if you're leading a hike and that you're about to turn the corner and there's a beautiful vista, you don't tell people, in just a minute you're going to see the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. You let them get ahead and find that on their own. It's there. You're leading them towards that beauty, but they have to discover it for their own. And those are those absolutely magic moments when you're interpreting or being a naturalist. You know where they're headed, but they don't know what they're about to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And because then they're having a direct experience of awe and wonder. It's not something that you plugged and played and you instilled, but you inspired them to experience awe and wonder by letting that happen. And spiritual direction is the exact same container. It's non-directive. And I always think about it, it's like I kind of have two brains going. There's the one brain that is so deeply attentive to their current experience and very invested in the story that they're sharing with me. And then the back brain has a general idea of where we might be headed. But we are experiencing that discovery together, and we are encountering moments of surprise, and they are allowed in that particular way that our spiritual direction is practiced. They are allowed then to have their own direct divine experience. It's not something that is offered to them. They're uncovering it all on their own.
And it's probably the same thing that makes you a really great director, that makes me a good naturalist, is we have all that nerdy stuff in our heads that if somebody says, what is this I don't understand, we can explain, but we don't have to, it's not our job to feed it to them, it's their job to seek it out. And I think there's probably a lot of similarity there in how our brains are working during a hike or a session or a reading or whatever.
Absolutely. Like we hold the meta perspective, but we are deeply invested in the micro discovery, and it's delightful because you also have the opportunity to be just as surprised and to be called back into awe and wonder. Even though you've experienced it a million times, because you're companioning somebody on this discovery, you too get to go, oh, did you see that? That was amazing. And then to just feel so held in that.
Yeah.
So both of our work really is distilled down into paying attention, attentiveness. We hear about mindfulness in spiritual language, and then there is the practice of observing. So how do you think attentiveness in science parallels mindfulness and contemplation?
Well, again, I think they're so closely, you can't really pull those apart. When I'm teaching, whether I'm teaching a nature journaling class or I'm teaching how to be a naturalist class, the first assignment is really a sit down, shut up, and listen kind of class. Like, you go out, you sit for 15 minutes, and you are just present. And people... It's always fast. I've been doing it for 30 years and it has never gotten old. You give that assignment to somebody, just go sit for 15 minutes. Just sit and observe. And people come in and say, oh my gosh, that was the longest 15 minutes of my life. I thought it was 3 hours. Because we don't ever stop. We just are in our daily lives. We're not geared to stop and look and listen. And so that's such an important skill, whether it's listening to the way our bodies are feeling or working, what our brain is doing, or what's going on outside of us. And you can't do any nature study or scientific study without that observation piece. And it's such an important skill for people to learn to just take a breath, slow down, and just learn to be okay with doing nothing for 15 minutes. The first time I did that, I said, go out. When it feels like you've been sitting for 15 minutes, come back. I took away their watches. And people were back in like 4 minutes, 7 minutes. Nobody made it to the 15-minute mark because it was such an odd phenomenon for them to have to just go and do that. So to me, it's the same in whatever you're doing. You just have to sit with it for a few minutes, learn to slow down, and then you can't observe until you actually can shut your brain down a little bit to do that.
I'm so moved that this is where you begin with those who are nature enthusiasts, but it was also the very first lesson that I had in training as a spiritual director when I was trained under the Sisters of Humility of Mary.
I love that.
They sent us out. We hadn't even done introductions, and they said, go find a spot and just contemplate, to be still and know. And we had a direct, divine, transcendent experience before we even began the nuts and bolts of what it means to be a spiritual director. And I remember picking a particular tree and concentrating very hard. At that time, I was a humanist religious professional, concentrating very hard on, like, what does it mean to know God? And then this wind, it was so gentle, just brushed across my face, and it felt like the most delicate touch of an intimate lover, and I was like, oh.
Or a gentle slap to just stop and pay attention.
Exact, both, which is to me how the divine presents, which is so gentle and also, please stop what you're doing.
The second half of that same activity is to go then out for usually another 15 minutes or 10 minutes with an index card, and you write down everything you see. So I'm assuming that's kind of like the same idea of sort of spiritual journaling. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? But when people do that, it's fascinating to look at their cards when they bring them back in, because some people start with the really big things. Like, see the sky and the clouds and then a tree, and at the end they see an ant or a dewdrop on a leaf. Other people are totally opposite. They can only see the tiny little things that are right in front of them, and they miss like the mountain view. And I think it tells people a lot about how their own brains are working, how their lists come apart. Some people do it all by color. Like, they list all the green things that they see, and then they move on to other colors. But it's fascinating to help kind of pick apart how your brain is observing and looking at everybody's is so different.
What that again, we blow my mind all the time.
It's amazing.
I love how we blow my mind all the time. But what you're describing from a spiritual formation theory perspective is that to contemplate means to consider the vastness of God. And why we talk about our psychological clutter in a spiritual direction session is because we want to see what perspective you have. What's your worldview? Are you only looking at this tiny little dewdrop? Are you looking at the mountain? Did you totally miss the mountain? And that's why we do things like the Enneagram. What eyes are you seeing through? But the intention ultimately of spiritual formation theory is that we increase our ability to see, that we increase our ability to understand, and more about ourselves, more about our interconnectedness, and more about those glimpses of the divine. So we're both following the same practicum. Our outcomes are very similar, but they're also very different. We're both trying to connect to something larger, and we're going about them the same way. We're just using
a different language for the same ideas. Yeah.
So we've talked about how for both of us there is this constant process of discovery. And as we come to know new things and learn new things and have our perspective expanded, we do notice that there's an edge where I've encountered what I can encounter, I've understood what I can understand, and I have to go to the next thing. We can intuit that we've reached an edge of our understanding. And then we have to ask more questions. But what we don't appreciate, at least from the spiritual formation perspective, is that moment, that edge, actually has to include a level of skepticism. I've known what I know, and in order to expand, now I need to question and critically think about what I've gained so far. And it's so necessary for the continued unfolding of spiritual deepening. So from your perspective, what role does skepticism play in fostering a healthy relationship with natural history?
Well, it's such when we started that's a little bit of the conversation, I had a whole other anecdote in mind, but as you were talking, another one came very clear to me from one of my most recent classes as a blacksmith. And I was in a class, and I had decided it was a sculpture class, and I wanted to make this big ichneumon wasp, which is this cool wasp with a big, long, swoopy tail that lays its eggs into logs, into larvae that live in logs. And I had in my head that this is what I wanted to make, and I had technical drawings of it. I had actual specimens. I had patterns. I had the whole anatomy laid out. And as I was sculpting, it wasn't coming together. And the instructor asked me what I was making, and I explained it. And she said, "So why are you making it this complicated?" I was like, "Well, the thorax, or the abdomen, has 9 segments. And in my mind, it has 9 segments. That's what I know about this wasp. Does it have to have 9 segments? Because that's not working. But it has 9 segments. But it doesn't have to. But it has 9 segments." And she said, "Are you going to use this to teach anatomy?" No, I wasn't going to teach it. The only thing I wanted was to have this cool wasp that people would see, and then I could tell them about ichneumon wasp. That was the goal, was this gateway. And she said, "So if you're not going to teach it, use it to teach anatomy, make it so it fits the goal of what you're teaching." And I was totally skeptical of what she was saying, but I followed her instruction, and she's absolutely right. It didn't need 9, 7 worked just fine, and it's actually perfect. And so I think sometimes for me, it's easy to get so stuck in your brain about what you know or what you don't know that you can't see that sort of larger picture, and it takes somebody else pointing out why you're being skeptical about it. I mean, being skeptical is sort of part of most of our natures, maybe some of us more than others, and I tend to be skeptical about everything. But I think that was such a good example of if she hadn't pushed me to get past that, I'm not sure that I'm too skeptical, that's not going to work. And when you and I talk a lot, it feels what you're talking about is so brand new, that whole world of looking at our spirituality and looking at that end of things, that I have to push through and I get, that makes total sense. But it's good to be a little skeptical, because when you push through it, you end up in a much better place than if you weren't questioning it to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the role of spiritual direction, I often see that with people who have experienced the divine in a particular way, that they know that there's a steadfastness in this presence, and that they'll say well, I felt it here and here, and I've seen it there, and I've seen it there, and now I'm prayerful and I'm not experiencing it in all the ways that I had previously experienced it. And so they become very skeptical, and that's oftentimes when they'll disconnect from their spirituality. Well, God isn't here for me anymore. And so the invitation of the spiritual director becomes, well, is that true? And how do we use your skepticism actually to deepen your divine understanding? That you thought the divine showed up here, here, and here, and you have direct experience of all of that, and that feels very real and meaningful to you, and you can rely on that. But what if your divine experience is also in these places that you didn't even look before? So it's very similar to the form of the wasp. Does your God have to show up this way, and that's the only way your God can experience? And if you aren't right, and if you're not companioned through that in the role of a spiritual director, people will often abandon their spiritual expression.
I would have left the project if I hadn't had a teacher who pushed me to get through that. I would have just said, I can't, it's not looking right, I can't do it. Instead of finding what you just said, some help to find a different way that the wasp could look or the wasp could be.
Yeah, and that's where spiritual direction, and so much so with you as well that I've observed, it's spiritual direction is the role of the teacher. It's the role of the guide. It's the role of the inspirer. It's the role of the challenger. It's the role of just bearing witness, and you're bringing all of that to the container. And I've seen you do the same as a naturalist. How much of our humanity can we bring to this observation?
Yeah, and how much of it is so much about connecting with ourselves, but connecting us with each other. During the pandemic, when the pandemic first hit, and we all just went home, I'd never heard of Zoom. I knew that you could do videos on Facebook, but we didn't have any of this, none of this kind of technology like what we're doing now. But I knew as soon as I went home, I started getting messages from like my people, my clients and people that came to programs, and they felt, it was only 3 days in, but they were already feeling isolated. They were scared. They were missing that connection. They didn't know what was happening. And so we started doing to look back on it now, it was terribly muddy. But we read Sand County Almanac together over Facebook, and each week we'd meet, and I held up little note cards because I didn't know how to type in a PowerPoint into Facebook. I'd hold up a sign in front of the screen that had a question on it, and people would type their answers into the chat. And it was one of the coolest connection things I've ever felt, because all I had to do was set up a safe place for people and then ask some good questions, which is exactly what you do every day, is set up a safe place and ask people the right questions for their own health and for the health of the community. I had never seen that before in such a powerful way. I know you see that all the time, because that is very specifically your job, but it hadn't been mine up to that point. But for me, it made really clear that is really our job for everybody, is to really build community and foster community, whether it's through nature or through some other way.
And connection. As you were talking about those that you serve reaching out to you saying, I feel disconnected, those same humans, perhaps with different interests, were reaching out to me and other spiritual directors saying, how can I foster connection? And that is the universal human experience here, is where do I find a sense of connection? And it doesn't have to be either or. We can find it in the natural world. We can find it in our spiritual expression. But to recognize that we are wired for connection, and that when we don't tend to that or do that in an examined way, whether that's through the scientific method or through spiritual formation theory, we can feel very cast adrift, and we can suffer tremendously because we are hardwired for connection.
And as somebody who's so much an introvert, that has always been one of those tricky concepts. Like, I like to be home by myself. I like to go for days and not have to talk to anybody. But I can only do that because I have such a firm community around me. I don't think I could do that if I didn't have a community that I knew was there, whether I was talking to them or not. And yeah, that idea of community is so, it's the same thing in, nothing in nature stands alone. It's all part of a community. And you can't really talk about the tree without talking about the mushrooms.
And we can't talk about our individual wanderings, as we are individuating and coming into ourselves without recognizing that we are participating in a larger culture, and that so much of our spiritual health is also rooted in a sense of community, and that we have to be seen in order to understand ourselves, and we have to be mirrored in order to feel like we have a sense of meaning and a desire to continue to engage with life.
Yeah, in ecology, there's a saying that ecology, the world ecology, is not only more complicated than we know, it's more complicated than we can know. So we are physically not possible of doing that. And so nature is so complex, our spirituality is so complex. I mean, it's no wonder that more of us, there's no doubt that most of us probably need more spiritual direction, because it's such a complicated world, as is anything, that everything needs a teacher in some way or other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Can you share a moment when observing nature actually shifted your perspective on life?
I always struggle with this question. I've been asked this question before, and they're always so subtle. I feel like I'm constantly shifting my perception. I think one of the times where I realized that not so much my perception of life, but my perception of community really shifted, was I was leading a trip in Colorado from the nature center, so a group of people who wanted to go look at nature. And it had been a really great day. We found lizards and all the things that we really looked for. It had been a really good day. And we'd stopped, coming home that night, we'd stopped at a lookout point just to stretch our legs. And it was one of those days, there was a storm across the valley, rainbow in the sky. It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And I was a little choked up, and I looked around, and everybody was in tears. The whole, we weren't talking to each other. Everybody was just standing there, tears streaming down our faces. I get teary. Just thinking about it, it was such an amazing, collective. We didn't even talk about it. We didn't have to talk about it. We were just all there. We all hugged each other. We got back in the van, and we went home. But it really impacted that kind of collective community. It was back to community. We were all experiencing this incredible thing all together. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a good lesson for me. But I mean, there's just so many, every time you see something in nature, it is life. So every, circle of life, and any lesson you want to teach, there's a ecology component that you can pull to go with it.
What I'm moved by is how that shared experience was unspoken. There was something, the transcendent element or the force, mm-hmm. whatever anybody wants to name it, came in and injected itself into that moment. And everyone felt it, and no one had to name it. And we often say that ministry is really just naming this human experience as human experiences happen. But it can be just as profound if you are witnessing this transcendent intercept an everyday moment, and it doesn't even have to be named. It's proven, air quotes, it's proven by the fact that everyone tuned into it in that same
and probably moment. All for very different reasons. I think if we had sat down to analyze it, we would have all been thinking about different things or something, but it stopped us all in our tracks, which is it's a beautiful thing when that kind of shared universal concepts kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. It's absolutely what I love about worship, and we do have data and research has been done on what happens in a human when voices are mixed, whether it's a concert or a worship service, that all of a sudden we are connected to ourselves and we are connected to something larger. And Parker Palmer talks about being alone together. Yeah. And it's that phenomenon of something moved me, and it is my own personal story, and I'm alone in that, and I'm observing that, but I'm with another. Yeah. And to be alone together is actually where we find the greatest part of our humanity, both individual and shared. Yeah. I love that story. Mm-hmm. I love that story. As a naturalist, are there ways to help people name those shared experiences?
I think as scientists and then as naturalists, so I kind of have those two things separated in my head, but we do struggle to name shared experiences sometimes because they're beyond, They're beyond that scientific realm. For instance, there's the light that comes through beech leaves, that filters through leaves. It's gorgeous. Everybody sees it and feels it, and you can stand under it and you feel like you're in a cathedral. They did give that a name to that, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but it has a very specific name. And so we have done that in some cases where there's these phenomenon that so many of us have shared, and our only way to make sense of them is to give it a name, which doesn't necessarily capture that moment, but anybody who's felt that when they hear that name can feel that experience again. But I think for the rest of it, it's one of the reasons why we need things like spiritual direction, because there aren't words for some of the things that we see and feel in science or in nature. We need that spiritual direction language that we have to get from somebody else to help make sense of it.
Yeah, words are imperfect. And we are such deeply feeling beings that it's hard to capture the depth of what we're experiencing, which is why as a spiritual director, I also bring in symbolic language, whether that is through tarot or even astrology or even through dreams. We have to be able to use those symbols to point to something, to say, this is what I'm trying to say. This image, this symbol, this metaphor is what's going on inside of me that I cannot quite find the words. And even if I do find the words, they're going to always feel imperfect because they will never match the depth. And that's where I tend to steer away from using tarot or astrology as reading the unseen in a psychic sense, but more as a compass, a point of orientation. If you are trying to explain this experience within you and you see this image, how does that help you articulate that so that you can take that numinous and make it more practical and applicable in your own life, and so that can increase your understanding of yourself and the world around you.
Well, I think that's why I enjoy the conversations with you so much, because you do have that extra language that I don't have to explain things and to make connections. But I also like that you steer away from the woo-y stuff, because that makes a lot of us who are not as in touch with that end of things uncomfortable when it's like, ooh, I'm going to, whatever, crystal gaze in the crystal ball and all of that sort of stuff. And the way you approach it is it's science-based. It's the same way that I look at a track in the forest and know what animal was there. It's the same thing that you're doing with the symbols in a dream. And so that having that shared language makes the connections even stronger, and it helps. The way you teach is very much the way I teach, which helps lead to new insights that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to get to with the language that I have.
And I would say the same in being in relationship with you, where I tend to prefer the numinous. It's really hard for me to concretize my own personal experience, but by speaking with you and sensing and naming our shared language, that actually concretizes my experience. Oh, when you say this, that you're looking at patterns and observation, that's exactly what I'm doing as a tarot reader. I'm looking for patterns and observations, and that can anchor this. And I'm struggling with the word use, but I want to say legitimizes.
Yeah.
You're not just floating in the ether. You actually are having a very human experience, and we're just finding ways to name that experience and to inspire that internal experience within someone.
Yeah, that's why we're such a good team.
We are, though. What practices would you recommend for people wanting to observe the natural world more deeply?
Well, I would say go do that first activity that we talked about just a little bit ago. Go sit outside for 15 minutes. I also teach a class, I call it the flower hour, and I tell people to go get a beverage of their choice and to go sit outside by one clump of flowers and just sit for, if you can do it for an hour, do it. If you can only do it for 10 minutes, do it for 10 minutes. And just focus on even that one flower. You'll be amazed at how much life is happening around that one flower, and how much you walk by every day and don't notice. So that's a really big one, is just taking time to literally stop and smell the roses. And then there's all these other great sort of nature journaling kinds of activities where you go out and just write down everything you see for 10 minutes, or go look for 10 shades of green around your yard, and just to see the variety of color. During COVID, when I was shut down, I thought I need to challenge myself as a naturalist. So I was feeling pretty good about myself back in those days, and I thought, I know a lot. I'm going to challenge myself to go out every day for a month and find something just in my own backyard that I've never seen before or that I can't identify. So that was, 3 years ago? I'm still doing that, and still almost every day I find something that I didn't know. So it's just it's actively looking for the things that you don't know. Mm-hmm. And that's a great practice. And when you start off learning about nature, there's a lot of things you're not going to know. But as you learn more, you're going to find it's that whole idea, I didn't know how much I didn't know until I knew it, kind of idea. So anything you can do like that. But most importantly, slow down, take a deep breath, and try to use all of your senses when you're exploring.
Pay attention on purpose,
yeah.
Which is what mindfulness is. And it's what a meditation practice is as well. If I can pay attention on purpose, I actually have a whole host of discovery about how I operate, how my mind works, who I think I am, and where I believe that I belong in the world.
And paying attention on purpose, it's also how we look at things. Like if you're looking at the night sky and you want to look at the North Star, the way our eyeballs are made, if you look directly at the North Star, it'll disappear because of the rods and cones. That's a whole science lesson. Rods and cones in our eyes, we'll skip that part. But you can't see things at night when you look directly at them. So you have to use your peripheral vision if you want to look at a constellation. And I think that's probably true of a lot of things in our lives too. When you stare directly at them, they just kind of get fuzzy and disappear. But if we look at them with our peripheral vision, or in your case with these other skill sets, they become crystal clear and you can really see them.
We blew my mind again. But when I'm working a dream with those that I serve, I will often invite them to return to that same foggy space, to go back into the dream. And I'll say, can I even join you in this dream? And I'll say, okay, let's just blur our vision a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so we're doing the same thing. We can't look directly at it because we'll kind of miss it. But if we blur our vision, it actually will emerge. It will become more clear. That symbolic language and the deeper meaning will become more clear because we've looked at it out of the side of our eye.
That's perfect. Again, why we're a perfect team.
Well, we are. How did this happen? Carrie, what do you hope our listeners take away from our conversation today?
Well, I would say two things. Really, first one, the message, we said it multiple times now, is to just make sure you're having time to be mindful, slow down, take a breath, notice what's going on around you outside and internally too. But then also I think it's so important to look for connections. I mean, this is not a connection I would have made organically, probably you either, unless we'd happened to be actually listening to each other in the hallway during some of those conversations. And it's turned out to be such an interesting partnership and helping us both to look at things differently. So I would say slow down, take a deep breath, literally smell the roses, and then, just be open to weird connections in life because they're everywhere.
Be still and know. Thank you for joining me today on the Path to Wholeness. I hope this conversation with Carrie sparked new ways of seeing the world and inspired you to explore the intersection of science and spirit in your own life. You can find Carrie's work at darwins-dream.com or on Instagram at Elvey, ELVEYCR. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, this was so much fun. It's always fun to talk to you and explore more.
It is. If you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to share it with a friend or leave a review. It helps others discover the podcast, and you can always join us on the journey at BethanySWard.com. Remember, the path to wholeness is always unfolding. It's in the questions we ask, the connections we nurture, and the wonder we allow ourselves to feel. Until next time, take care and stay curious.